seek to kill other people or seek to divide their communities or their societies the way that the people you're describing do?
Well, I'm not a person of faith, but I seek to kill the enemies of civilization. And I tell you what, I think it's immoral to tell me to love them.
But
I repeat, it is immoral, as is much of Christian doctrine.
Christopher Hitchens, welcome.
Very nice of you to have me.
Happy to have you here in the rodeo buckle of the Bible Belt.
Don't believe in any such thing.
You don't?
No.
So you don't feel outnumbered or outmanned coming to a place like Texas where they say people of faith are in great numbers?
It certainly wouldn't bother me to be the only atheist in the country, but right. I don't believe any of the so-called findings about this.
Why is that?
Well, from experience. I mean, 80% of Americans or so report to the opinion pollsters that they go to church regularly on Sunday. They don't. They lie. I tell you how I know that. Stand in the middle of any town of any size in the country at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. It's not 20% full.
Right.
There aren't enough churches in any case to take that many Americans. It's easy enough to lie to an opinion pollster about a matter of faith. And people think that's what they ought to be saying. It's one of the ways the religious get things too much their own way.
Is
that everyone's on their side and in their corner. They're not. People like Robertson and Falwell are widely regarded as complete clowns. Someone like Al Sharpton, who I debated in New York, is a charlatan, a mountebank. It's a disgrace. But it does remain the fact that such a man would not get away with this in our culture if he wasn't called reverend. People like this say they demand respect for their faith. Well, they're not getting it from me.
Now, we know that this book is selling. It's going to be number 3, I understand, when it debuts on the New York Times bestseller list next week. Mm-hmm. And it is, as of this morning, number 2 among all sellers on Amazon, behind only the not-yet-released Harry Potter book. So clearly, there are people who are buying this book.
And number 1 in nonfiction, if I may say it myself.
You may say it yourself. But still, this is a book that...
And it's not because of my blue eyes.
Oh.
I know what you were going to say, it's because, in common with some predecessor books by Professor Dawkins, Sam Harris, right. Professor Dennett, it's part of what we were just discussing, a feeling of annoyance at the prevalence of religious bullying and intimidation. Everyone in this studio, including yourself, has been subject to a fatwa, okay, by Mr. Bin Laden and his associates, and we've all been told that he wants us dead. That should be enough to get people alarmed. And that they mean it can't be doubted. You can see how they've managed to reduce the civil society in Iraq, the parties of God, nearly to a state of barbarism now. They say God gave them permission to do it. We say, what an extraordinary thing to be saying, don't we? So how can anyone believe a thing like that? Well, that's my question.
But is that
how can anyone believe that they're doing what God wants them to do?
Is that not the outlier, though, honestly? There are people of faith who do not seek to kill other people or seek to divide their communities or their societies the way that the people you're describing do.
Well, I'm not a person of faith, but I seek to kill the enemies of civilization. And I tell you what, I think it's immoral to tell me to love them.
But
I repeat, it is immoral, as is much of Christian doctrine, to command me to love these people. To the contrary, it should help to organize and discipline and make colder and more rational one's hatred of them and determination to be rid of them.
Well, the ones who wish harm to you, I understand. But if people of faith are of no consequence to you, if they leave you alone, they don't think much about you.
It's the one definition that they can't meet.
Right, which is?
I am a person of faith who will leave you alone. It's not in them. How can it be? They say God cares with whom I have sex, for example. They have to interfere in my life. Mm-hmm. Some of them say God cares what I eat. They have to interfere in my life. Some say God would mind what books I read. They have to interfere. Others will say it may be more compassionate. Well, they can't watch me go to hell. They have to intervene to stop that, otherwise they wouldn't be my friend. Mm-hmm. They'll love me to death if they have to.
Right.
The one thing they cannot do is leave me alone. Hence the book. Hence the argument. No, if someone said to me, look, I'll tell you what, Christopher, you and I are not quite the same. I say, well, how is that? So, well, my mother bore me, but didn't have sex with a man before that. I said, I had no idea. I say, well, how fascinating. He said, well, you see, it's like this. Because of that, you have to do what I say. That proves all my opinions are correct. I said, well, hold on. This sounds very weird to me, and actually now rather nasty.
Right.
Well, that's what you're supposed to have to believe.
If it were confined to them and people who believe what they believe, and did not extend over to you. And in fact, there are probably people who would argue that what they believe doesn't necessarily have to extend over to you. Would you be okay with that?
Well, possibly, but I'll tell you what else would happen. They'd start fighting among themselves. It's not they won't leave me alone, they won't leave people of other faiths alone. Most of the murder and torture and killing that goes on in Iraq is of two discrepant kinds of Muslim, slaughtering each other's families. The same is true in India, a Muslim on Hindu. In the Balkans, Catholic versus Orthodox Christians, and then combining to murder the local Muslims. We all get dragged into these terrible wars of faith. No, of course they won't leave us alone. They've gravely retarded civilization for hundreds of years. They're still doing it. There's no possibility of living a life that's untouched by this barbaric belief.
Well, again, let me talk about outliers and non-outliers. Is there a hierarchy in your mind? Certain faiths are more problematic to you in terms of that argument than others?
Well, my daughter goes to a Quaker school, for example, my youngest daughter in Washington. They teach non-resistance to evil, which I regard as an evil doctrine, but I don't regard it as evil as the preaching of evil is, right, shall we say. So if I'm told, well, do you mean that someone who's a member of the Society of Friends is the same as someone who supports the Ayatollah Khomeini? No, I don't. Of course not. But they all make the same mistake, which is to praise the idea of faith and to elevate it over reason and evidence, and to say, on the most important thing of all, which is why are we here, what are we to do, what is the meaning of our life, on the most important questions, they say that it's very important to decide it without evidence, that you must make an unprovable assertion, and then demand respect for it. Well, I think the sleep of reason brings forth monsters.
Why do you send your daughter to a Quaker school, if I may ask?
Well, I would have sent her to a Hebrew school. My mother was Jewish, and so was her mother. But if the education was as good, the Friends School in Washington is considered a very good school. I would send her to a Catholic school if it had higher standards.
Why not to a public school?
You can't do that in Washington. I'm really sorry to say. I mean, I hate to say it, but I can't use Antonia for a social experiment.
Do you take on the brand of faith that she's being exposed to at that school personally? Do you challenge the people there?
No, I don't have to. No, it's thought. I mean, if they wanted an argument, they could get one. Yeah, but I don't want my children to have any knowledge directly of what my opinions are.
Be drawn into this debate.
No, they'll find it out for themselves.
Right. You attended a religious school when you were a child.
Well, you have no choice in my country of birth.
Right.
Religion is compulsory in schools.
Indeed.
I went to a Methodist boarding school, yeah.
Tell the audience and the viewing audience about your first experience with this Mrs. Watts.
Oh, Mrs. Watts. This is when I was even younger at a Church of England boarding school for boys, mainly boys whose parents were in the armed forces, like mine, who were travelling, who were overseas. And we had Mrs. Watts, who was a lovely old lady, a widow, childless widow, fond of children, which I couldn't say for all my teachers. And she took us for nature walks, studying the beautiful part of Devon, southwestern England, where I'm from. Birds, trees, plants, flowers. And then she instructed us in what was called divinity, the scriptures, which I loved. I used to really like looking up the texts and then working out where the story had come from and what the parallels were in other books of the Bible, and indeed between the Old and New Testament. I enjoyed it. It was my first effort as a literary critic, I now realized. And the language of the King James Bible and the Cranmer Prayer Book is very important to me. One day, though, Mrs. Watts went too far. She tried to marry her role as nature teacher and scripture teacher, and she said, "Children, you see how God is good. He's made all the vegetation a lovely green colour, which is the colour most restful to our eyes. And imagine how horrible our lives would be if it was all purple or orange all the time." And I was 9, I think, and I thought, can I say this on your show? That's a child could see through this. Of course that's not true. So she's claiming to know more than she possibly could. Then I noticed, I thought, well, why would she? And I thought, well, I could see why that would be, because the same as the headmaster. If he appears in front of us holding the Bible every morning, it gives him authority in the real world, the here and now, never mind the hereafter. Who wouldn't? If they could enhance their power by pretending to be doing God's work, who wouldn't do it? So I was getting the essential information in my cortex at quite a young age.
Hitchens is pointing out something people don't like to admit. Religion often looks bigger than it really is. Surveys say around 70 to 80% of Americans are Christian, but actual church attendance is far lower. Studies from groups like Pew Research show weekly attendance is closer to 20 to 30%. That gap tells you people report belief because it's socially expected, not because they're actively practicing it. Then he goes further. He challenges religious authority. When someone is called reverend, they're often given automatic respect. But that title doesn't prove truth. It doesn't mean their claims are based on evidence. In science, claims have to be tested, repeated, and verified. Faith works the opposite way. It asks you to believe first without proof. Even the Bible reflects this idea. Hebrews 11:1 defines faith as the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That's belief without evidence. And Hitchens is saying that becomes a problem when people use it to gain influence or power over others.
Is that the moment that you identified yourself first as an atheist?
Wouldn't have known the word.
Right.
Wouldn't have known
At what point did you embrace that term?
I certainly had. That's how I know the feeling that many people have that they're the only one. They're surprised to find that millions of people have had similar experiences, as we all have. Mm-hmm. But I started then to object to being made to pray, and I found it anyway objectionable to be forced to say every morning that I was a wretched, worthless sinner. I thought, what is
Even
this?
though you may have been.
Even though the possibility exists that it could have been true. Well, here's the paradox of it, and I think it's a very unwholesome one. You're told first that you're made of nothing but the dust of the earth, and that you're born into sin and corruption, and you've committed crimes were committed by you before you were born. You're stuck with this, so you're saturated in guilt and shame as a little boy. But there's a compensating factor. The universe is designed with you in mind. After all, you are terribly important. You can be the most egomaniacal person you like, after all. Completely self-centered. The universe was designed with you in mind, and God has a plan for you. That makes up for it a bit. Both of these claims are highly unhealthy as well as utterly untrue.
And in conflict.
Well, I think one is designed as a compensation for the other.
Is that what it is?
Yes, I think so.
Right.
You terrify somebody. It's sadomasochism. You terrify somebody first, and you say, now I've really shaken you and upset you and given you bad dreams and told you about hell.
So here's this other thing.
I've got a real as long as you'll transfer your money to my church, and as long as you'll agree to do as I say on a number of other things, that's fine. Right. Well, I think this is positively immoral. I think it's actually actively wicked, as well as palpably false.
So there was no point at which you played the game. At no point did you sort of test this out, dip your toe in the water, say, well, let me see if I feel like this is for me. So you were not someone who tried out various faiths or one faith and then rejected it.
No, nothing like that. No. I mean, I studied them all, right. And I still do. And it's still, to me, a great department of learning, right. Because it's what precedes philosophy. Mm-hmm. Philosophy starts where religion ends, but you have to know where the break point comes. You
make a distinction in the book. I don't know that it's a distinction exactly, but you use the terms differently. Religion is one, but God worship is a phrase that I found interesting in the book. Explain the difference, or tell me there's no difference between the two.
I should perhaps underscore the distinction better. Yeah. I mean, you can, like my subject of biography, I'm a biographer in a small way of Thomas Jefferson. Right. He was a deist in that he thought that there must be or have been a creator. Right. Very common opinion in the late 18th century, early 19th century. The order and majesty of the universe, the rhythms of nature, this can't just be a chemical reaction, or must be a designer. But he didn't think that designer cared about or intervened in human affairs. So he believed in God, but he was not really religious. Deism is not a religion. Right. It still seems logical to many people that there must be a designer. But it's a huge step to say the designer cares what you eat or who you go to bed with. And why is it such a huge step? Because you have to claim to know the mind of God. Now, I know this much. I know that nobody does know that. Okay. I'm a mammal. I've never met another mammal who I think of as able to make that claim. I've met mammals much smarter than myself.
And you've met mammals who have claimed to be able to make that claim.
The place is rife with mammals who claim to be able to make that claim.
Right.
So it seems to be a mammalian weakness to say, not only do I know that God exists, but I happen to be able to inform you what he would now like you to do. And furthermore, since I'm acting for him, I'm the one who's going to tell you. Right. I say, no, just hold it right there. I will not be, put it as politely as possible, spoken to in that tone of voice by anybody.
You've been described actually as an atheist, but also as an anti-theist.
It's my self-definition.
Self-definition. So is there a similar distinction there?
No, it's just a refinement, if you like. Right. You could be an atheist and wish it were otherwise. I think, well, I've certainly met people who say they wish it were true. They tried to believe it. They just couldn't make themselves. It flies in the face of so much contrary evidence. Right. And there's no evidence on its side. So, pity about that, but can't believe it. I don't see it's a pity at all, because if it were true that there was a divine, celestial, all-powerful person who kept me under constant invigilation, supervision, surveillance from the moment I was conceived until, well, forever, because I can't escape from him even by dying. That's when the fun really begins. You get the option of going to somewhere which, when I was even quite small, paradise, that sounded to me like hell, a place of eternal praise of someone who had only done his job by creating you. Right. You had to keep thanking him forever sounds like hell to me, or worse, eternal torment for a crime you probably hadn't known at the time you were even committing. Right. These are the origins of totalitarianism. This is a wish. These are
the choices that you're.
This is a wish for unending slavery. Right. No, I don't share it, and therefore I'm very relieved that there is no evidence for it, no reason to believe it's true.
I want to talk about Iraq here in a second, but I want to ask about Salman Rushdie first, which may be an interesting segue. You consider Rushdie a good friend, and he considers you a good friend, and you were actually quite moved to speak out when the liberal fatwa against Salman Rushdie was ordered, and that was a pretty significant moment in terms of your view of religion, was it not?
It was my 9/11, if you like, 14th of February 1989.
Explain.
Well, on that day, Valentine's Day 1989, it doesn't really matter that he was a friend of mine. I'm proud to say that he was and remains one. Remember exactly what happened. The theocratic head, dictator of a foreign state, the Ayatollah Khomeini, appears in public to offer money in his own name, without disguise, for the suborning of murder. Pretty extraordinary thing for a religious leader to do. For the crime of writing a work of fiction, directed at someone who isn't even an Iranian, who lives in London. Now, this is a pretty frontal assault on everything that I believe in and value. Free expression, free inquiry, the right of the individual to be free of state terror, all of this. And I thought, it was the first time I thought, well, they're trying to change our regime, our society. Well, they mustn't be allowed to do that. But further than that, we better have to change theirs. We can't put up with this. Yeah. That was for a later time. At the time, I noticed another thing. Okay, here you have on the one side free expression, the liberty of the individual, the right of free inquiry, the right of literary production. On the other, superstition, murder, the offer of gain for murder. And, of course, a ticket to paradise, naturally, thrown in. And an offer of virgins to young men who mostly, as far as I can see, actually are virgins. Sick, repressed young men who've had their sex lives ruined by religion as well as everything else. Okay, pretty horrible. Where are the churches coming out on this? Well, the Pope said the problem was Salman Rushdie had committed blasphemy. The Archbishop of Canterbury said the problem was Salman Rushdie had committed blasphemy. The Chief Rabbi of Israel said the problem was Salman Rushdie had committed blasphemy. They all lined up in effect with the Ayatollah. So that's also part of my answer to your question was, I shouldn't judge religion by its fringe adherents.
Right.
From childhood, you're told you're sinful, guilty, and unworthy. In Christianity, Psalm 51:5 says you're sinful from birth. That means guilt before you've done anything. Then religion flips it and tells you the entire universe was made just for you. That contradiction isn't truth, it's control. Psychology backs this up. Studies on guilt conditioning show that people who are taught they are inherently flawed are easier to influence and more dependent on authority. That's exactly how religious systems maintain power. Then look at the claims themselves. Religion says an all-powerful being exists, watches everything you do, and cares about your private behavior. There is no scientific evidence for that, no measurable proof, nothing testable. Even worse, history shows where this leads. The fatwa against Salman Rushdie wasn't an accident. It was religion enforcing belief through violence. And major religious leaders didn't defend free speech. They sided with the idea of punishment for blasphemy.
Let me ask about Iraq in the remaining time we have left. You have very famously been a supporter of the war and have refused, in the face of criticism and of people who were like you, supporters of the war, backing down. You've refused to change your position. You continue to be a supporter of the war.
I think Iraq is a keystone state to which we owe a large number of debts, partly because of past policy errors going back through several administrations. That it would be absolutely unthinkable to abandon the Iraqi people to al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. That they demonstrate every day what would happen to the Iraqis if we withdrew, and to ourselves. It seems to me elementary. I prefer to say the word struggle rather than war. It's a struggle between my Iraqi and Kurdish friends, or rather my Arab and Kurdish Iraqi friends, and their allies. That's us, their friends. That's you and me, I hope, against barbarism. Call it a struggle. Saying stop the war sounds better, means you're anti-war, which is sort of okay. But if you just change it by one word, and not very much, what it says is surrender. It's not worth fighting over. Let the other side win. Well, we have nothing worth defending. This is moral and political suicide.
What people would say, though, is that it's not so much end the struggle; it's end, again, putting words in their mouth, admittedly, but end the deaths of American soldiers on behalf of a cause that is of questionable interest. Now, I know you disagree with this, but is of questionable national interest to this country. You disagree?
Well, they may want the struggle to be bloodless, but then they should have picked another enemy. They should have found a nicer one than Al-Qaeda to be fighting.
You believe that...
Wait a minute. You see the incoherence of what... I know you're not speaking in your own words, but suppose that was someone's position, see how incoherent it would be. The same people say it's a distraction from the fight against Al-Qaeda. It is the fight against Al-Qaeda. Giving Al-Anbar province to Al-Qaeda is not taking part in the struggle against Al-Qaeda, it's capitulating to Al-Qaeda. If you want to fight against Al-Qaeda and not have any unpleasant bloodshed, then maybe you should pick some other enemy to have. But this one seems to have picked us. And I expect the fight to be going on for the rest of my life, and I expect people to get killed in it a lot. But I want the United States Armed Forces, who are playing this exemplary role in Iraq, are getting better and better and better at reducing our casualties and increasing theirs, and that's what I like to see. And I want those two graphs to get even sharper than they are now.
When critics of your point of view say, but Al-Qaeda was involved in 9/11 and Iraq wasn't, and yet we chose to fight in Iraq as opposed to in Afghanistan.
Well, we went first to Afghanistan and cleaned out the Taliban.
Right, but there are those who would say that we didn't finish the job in Afghanistan, and actually the Al-Qaeda and Taliban have come back in greater numbers in Afghanistan than before the invasion, or equal numbers, and that, in fact, Al-Qaeda was not in Iraq until we began the war. Again, that's the popular criticism.
Yeah, I know. I don't know how people believe it's in the face of all the evidence. First, we did clean out the Taliban from Afghanistan. If they're not all gone, it's because, unfortunately, our supposed ally Pakistan has a long common border with Afghanistan and is never going to let its former clients completely go out of business. But they can't get Afghanistan back. We can completely stop them from doing that. In Iraq, we know very well that the leading ghoul of Al-Qaeda, Mr. Zarqawi, was in Baghdad well before that. And if you look even at Mr. Tennett's book, a man who dislikes the whole operation and who never wanted us to go to Iraq in the first place.
And you don't seem to have much respect for.
None whatever. I can't believe he was ever the head of anything, let alone of a national intelligence service. But he says in his book, the alarming, really truly alarming signs of increasing cooperation between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden just could not any longer be ignored, unless you were willing to face the American people later and say, well, perhaps I should have paid attention.
The position that bin Laden and Hussein were in any way allied is one you acknowledge is in dispute. There are people who disagree about that.
No, there's no disagreement about it. There's only disagreement about the extent of it. We don't know if it rose to the level of operational cooperation or not. Well, I tell you one thing, if it was up to me, it never would. Mm-hmm. The regime that was flirting with it would cease to exist. Gone.
Would we not
president who didn't do that should have been impeached.
Would we not have been better off killing bin Laden as opposed to moving off of bin Laden and getting on to Hussein?
No, we had an appointment with Saddam Hussein anyway. Remember, both houses voted under the Clinton administration in '98. I think without demur for the Iraq Liberation Act, that it shall be the policy of the United States of America to remove the Saddam Hussein regime anyway. Mm-hmm. 9/11 is essentially irrelevant to this. It only makes it more urgent.
Right. And you wrote on Slate one of
and that was partly because of his consistent and up until then unwaveringly consistent use of Baghdad as a place of hospitality for Abu Nidal, for Abu Abbas, the man who killed Klinghoffer, for his financing of the Islamic Jihad suicide bombers in Palestine. All of that was undisputed as well. The idea that he wouldn't go near the next most lethal anti-American force in the region is on its own face absurd.
Well, we're out of time. A lot more to talk about on Iraq. I wish we had longer, but I appreciate very much your being here. Thank you very much and congratulations on the book, and good luck with your tour.
Very nice of you to have me.
Thank you, Christopher Hitchens. Appreciate it.
Hitchens shifts the argument to something bigger. Religion doesn't stay private. It shapes politics, war, and violence. Look at the data. The Global Terrorism Index consistently shows that a large percentage of terrorist attacks are tied to extremist religious ideology, especially groups that openly justify violence using scripture or divine authority. This isn't limited to one religion. History shows the same pattern. The Crusades were fought in the name of Christianity. Modern extremist groups act in the name of Islam. Different labels, same foundation. Belief that violence is justified because it serves a higher power. And here's the problem. Once someone believes they are acting on behalf of God, There is no room for reason. You can't debate it. You can't test it. It becomes absolute. Even in the Bible, commands like Deuteronomy 20:16-17 describe destroying entire populations under divine instruction. That kind of thinking doesn't disappear. It evolves.
North Korea, Iraq, and Iran, and I'd like to talk about each. North Korea, when were you last there, and how did you get in the first place?
Well, you can't get into North Korea as a journalist. So I went under my other professional capacity of being a university lecturer. I got the New School to write a letter. It was kosher too. I mean, I wasn't faking an identity, but I was concealing the fact that I was a reporter. And you'd have to go on an organized trip.
What year was this?
This was just before the election of President Bush, actually.
So it was 99 or late 2000?
Yeah, it was. Clinton was hoping to go to North Korea before his term was up, but he messed things up so badly by then he didn't have time. Madeleine Albright arrived a week after I had left.
I see.
And that was, I think, the last trip she made. And so we're talking about the cusp of the of the millennium, among other things. And
you're right, of North Korea. It is exactly as if it was modeled on 1984, Orwell's novel. The leader worship, the terror, the uniformity, the misery, the squalor. All true. Still?
Yes, it was. The state was founded, actually, I think the year that 1984 was published, and it's as if they sort of took the book and thought, I wonder if we could make this work.
Right, right.
Well, one tries to avoid cliche. I remember I went to Prague during the old days, the bad old days of the communist regime, to attend a dissident meeting. I thought, whatever happens to me, I'm not going to mention the name Kafka in what I write. I'm going to be the first reporter who goes to Prague and doesn't bring up Kafka.
Does not say Kafka.
And the policeman came in, the secret police broke into the meeting I was at and slammed me up against the wall and said, you're under arrest. And I said, what for? And they said, we're not telling you what for. And I thought, damn, now I have to resort to cliche. I have to mention Kafka.
You have to say Kafka.
Well, if you go to North Korea determined not to mention Orwell or Orwellianism or 1984, you will, I'm sorry, you'll be forced to. They make you do it.
Clinton administration engaged in bilateral negotiations with North Korea and brought the nuclear program to a halt. The Bush administration has refused bilateral negotiations, with the result that every informed expert of whom I'm aware says that North Korea now has 2, 3, 4, some low number, but they have nuclear weapons. Who is better, Clinton or Bush?
Well, I think your two questions pull apart on each other.
You may rewrite the question.
If they do have nuclear weapons now, with the capacity to make them, which I have no reason to doubt, then that program can't ever have been brought to a halt, can it?
Well, no, as I understand it,
I think the halt was illusory. I think it was a feint. The North Koreans have never abandoned the ambition.
They put things up on they were pretty close under Clinton, but they did set things up on the shelf. And under Bush, they brought them back down.
That for them is a mere tactic.
What I'm probing at here is, has Bush messed this one up?
Well, we don't know yet whether his strategy of working with China is going to be a success or not. I mean, objectively, it could work for this reason. If the North Koreans go on in this manner, you remember the way they tested their first missile was to fire it across Japan without warning.
Yes, right.
The Japanese think, Christ, there's a missile on the other side of us. Now from North Korea, bang. If the North Koreans go on in this way, Japan, which can make a nuclear weapon in no time, will do so. It is not in the interests of China that Japan becomes a nuclear power. And they must understand that the North Koreans are forcing this contingency upon them. So it seems to me there's a reasonable chance of triangulating the diplomacy in the region.
But you don't feel you're not willing to protest outside the White House and say, look, you must do something. You're quite content.
Well, no, where I think we should be protesting is this: North Korea is a slave state. Its people are state property, and they used to be fed in return for being slaves. Now they're starved in return for being slaves. This is intolerable. We should be helping to open an underground railway for these slaves into China and forcing the Chinese to take these refugees and then allow them to transit to South Korea. They don't have, the Chinese have to take them.
So we should be pushing much harder on humanitarian grounds.
We certainly should, and making it.
Next, Christopher Hitchens justifies the war in Iraq.
Katha Pollitt, your former colleague at The Nation, quote, talking about you, you set up the equation so that there is no way to oppose invading Iraq except to be a coward or a covert admirer of dictatorship and theocracy. Well, I don't think it's cowardly to be extremely wary of war, especially preemptive war, close quote. Now, no matter how well things may seem to be going in Iraq after the election of January 31st, the war was optional. the war was optional, and nobody ought to engage in a war when he has other choices, correct?
No, false.
All right.
I wrote a short book about Iraq,
The title of
which is The Long Short War, the postponed liberation of Iraq. I could have called it the Short Long War, but I thought the Long Short was better. Been at war with Saddam Hussein since the day that he crossed the border of Kuwait. Not to invade it, remember, or even to occupy it, but to annex it, to make it cease to exist. Yes. An unprecedented level of aggression, destruction of a member state of the United Nations, not invasion of it.
Right.
And member of the Arab League and of the Islamic countries, the province of Iran.
Right. Iraq.
The province of Iran.
Right.
His withdrawal from there was negotiated under various conditions, that not all of which he agreed to meet. So he had to be monitored by international sanctions, which meant that Iraq had lost its sovereignty, and enforced by no-fly zones, which meant that 2/3 of his airspace no longer belonged to him, and he fired at those coalition planes every day for 10 years. So we were in a state of armed truce at the very best.
Right.
At some point, someone was going to make a decisive move to end this state of suspended animation. On past form, we would have left it to Saddam to decide what the next crisis was going to be. We always had.
Right.
I thought it was time to say, no, we'll end it, and this time it'll be on our terms. You will find out when it's in. We're not going to wait for you to take initiative. But that's not preemption.
Did the Bush administration make a mistake in using that word preemptive? Bush, in one State of the Union or the other, used the word preemptive. They used that several times, and everybody laughed. Was that an error?
Yes, because it was an attempt to make the analogy with Afghanistan.
Now, what about the talk about weapons of mass destruction? Was that also an error? That is to say, you've just laid out an argument. I myself consider it not only plausible but compelling. In fact, I consider it decisive. However, the Bush administration did not make quite that same argument. They could have, but they didn't. Was that just ham-fistedness?
Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair, I'm sorry to say, both decided that it was a little easier to frighten people than to persuade them. This is a common political temptation. What I just described to you would make it possible to define Saddam Hussein as a permanent threat, it seemed to me.
Yes.
Because he had done the four things that mean that a country can lose its sovereignty and be invaded. Invade other countries,
right?
Persia, Iran, Kuwait. Commit genocide, in this case in Kurdistan.
Right.
Fool around with weapons of mass destruction, which he used on his own soil. I will not say on his own people, because they were not his own people. That's all the same. Right. On his own soil and in Iran, and harbor international terrorists. Now, he'd done all of these four things and was addicted to all four activities, as a matter of fact. Amazing, really extraordinary. He was not, as Miss Pollitt said, that we picked a fight with him, but that we allowed this to go on for so long.
Right. And had Blair and Bush relied on that?
Permanent threat, yes, but the imminent threat is scare tactics. Now,
but you're not willing to cut them a little bit of slack because they did have intelligence saying there are weapons of mass destruction.
Well, there were weapons of mass destruction. I'd go further than that. I mean, the common view now is that the hunt for weapons of mass destruction pulled up an empty net, did nothing of the kind. Didn't find stockpiles on a shelf, but it found a very well-organized program for the making of nuclear and chemical and biological weapons, and for the concealment of that program.
As indeed the New York Times has in a rather ham-fisted way confirmed for us now.
And as is confirmed in a brilliant book by Saddam Hussein's chief nuclear physicist, Dr. Obeidi, who it wasn't just making claims of this kind, which someone who'd survived the regime might be expected to do, but was able to lead people to the elements of a nuclear centrifuge, buried in his own back garden under the orders of Qusay Hussein, whose job it was to run weapons concealment for the Ba'ath Party.
Hitchens brings up something important. When belief systems mix with power, you don't get freedom, you get control. Look at North Korea. It's not technically religious, but it functions the same way. Absolute loyalty, unquestioned authority, and punishment for doubt. That's what happens when people are trained not to question. Religion teaches the same structure. In Islam, apostasy can carry the death penalty in multiple countries. In Christianity, questioning God is framed as rebellion. John 3:18 says, "Those who don't believe are already condemned." That's not evidence. That's pressure. Now look at real-world outcomes. Countries with the highest levels of enforced religion, like Iran or Afghanistan under the Taliban, consistently rank among the lowest in freedom indexes from groups like Freedom House. Less speech, less rights, more control.
Explain to me the psychological state on the ground, which I find so difficult to understand. The population did indeed hate Saddam Hussein. Nobody doubts that, correct? And the population, at the very minimum, is intensely resentful of Americans. True?
Yes.
True? Explain that conundrum.
The welcome that I've seen American and British forces get in parts of Iraq is something I want to mention first, because there are people who say that never happened. It's commonly said by political philosophers like Maureen Dowd, say, that where were the sweets and where were the flowers? Well, I saw it happen with my own eyes, and no one's going to tell me that I didn't. I saw it months after the invasion, people still lining the roads, especially in the south.
In the south?
Especially in the south.
Right.
Still lining the roads and waving, and the children waving, which is always the sign, because if the parents don't want them to, they don't.
Right.
For miles, it was the nearest I'll get to taking part in the liberation of a country, to arriving with a liberating army. I'll never forget, and I will not allow it not to be said that did not happen. And in the marshes too, the marsh area of the country, which was drained and burned out, poisoned by Saddam Hussein. Again, almost hysterical welcome. And in Kurdistan, in the north. So extraordinary. But remember, you said the population hated Saddam Hussein. That's true, really true. But more than anything, they feared him. They were terrified of him. These are people who were not just forced to obey under terrible and believable threat, but made to applaud, made to participate, made to come out and vote, made to come out and demonstrate that they loved him, made to applaud when their relatives were executed. You know, if your kids were going to be shot, you had to attend and you had to applaud. Okay, a pornographic regime, in other words. Now, people who've been through that are humiliated. Okay, they're disgusted with themselves and depraved to some extent. Well, when they get a chance to show their courage, they very often will, even if it takes a somewhat ignoble form.
Right.
So now that Mr. Muqtada Sadr, for example, who was as quiet as a mouse when there was real, now he knows there isn't going to be a reprisal. He can throw a bit of a chest.
Right. Okay. So in some sense, all this is healthy.
Yes, it's purging. Yeah, and as we saw in the elections, the way that people actually hung together and were developing now more of a sense of a communal solidarity.
I have heard Paul Wolfowitz say that one mistake that the United States made was that we didn't hold the elections a year earlier.
That's absolutely right.
Absolutely right.
Well, the despised Ahmed Chalabi, who's still a friend of mine and whom I still admire, was arguing that at the time many a chance was missed to transfer sovereignty and to have an election. Well, nor will we get back the months that we wasted not doing that and behaving like occupiers instead.
But you're generally optimistic now about Iraq.
Well, it's been moved into the post-Saddam era, and it's helping helping neighboring countries to.
It's not going to fall. It's not going to break into three pieces.
This is the flag of Kurdistan in my lapel, but my Kurdish comrades say that their main responsibility is for the new Iraq now.
All right.
And they, who would have every right to say we want to get out of this prison house of a state, are willing to instead cooperate to help to emancipate the rest of it. I think that's an extraordinary sacrifice on their part. Deserves more recognition than it's had.
Third member of the Axis.
Finally, the last member of the Axis of Evil, Iran.
Like North Korea a year or two ago, Iran is embarked on a nuclear program. The Bush strategy let the Europeans negotiate with the Iranians while the Americans make threatening noises, a policy that, it could well be argued, has so far proven 100% ineffective. Sir?
How right that is. Let's remember, by the way, that the nuclear program in Iran was started by the Shah. The Bushehr reactor, for example, was built by him in megalomaniac days, and if he'd been a little faster, he might have been able to hand over an entire fully finished nuclear program to Ayatollah Khomeini. Remember, any state that goes nuclear, in a sense, makes its successors and sometimes its enemies nuclear powers as well, or runs at risk. So, there are differences, however, I think. One is, we had every reason to think if Saddam Hussein had a thermonuclear weapon, he'd have found an early occasion to use it.
Right.
Either use it or use it for blackmail.
Right.
I don't have that fear, actually, about the Iranians. There's no one they can go to war with. And incidentally, we've just done them the rather large favor of removing their two greatest enemies, the Taliban and the Iraqi Ba'ath Party.
Right.
They're not going to have a nuclear war with Israel because they would lose it.
Yes.
And furthermore, nuclear weapons aren't usable even by the most fanatical Islamists in Palestine, because you'd have to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, as well as the Wailing Wall, and kill the Palestinians as well as the Jews, in other words. So the immediate danger isn't that terrifying. The problem is that one doesn't want to reward the cheating and concealment and theft and smuggling and black market acquisition, the open contempt for international law that's involved, but the regime might also give way in time to a successor regime that would be more internationalist and more democratic. That option was not going to occur naturally in Iraq, and it certainly isn't going to occur naturally in North Korea.
You've said that in North Korea, the Bush administration, the United States, ought to be pushing much harder on the humanitarian line.
Yes.
Now, my colleague at the Hoover Institution, Abbas Malani, himself an Iranian, who spent some time in the Shah's jails, points out or argues that the young people in Iran, and the population, well over half the population is 25 or younger, is immensely favorably disposed toward the United States. That what we ought to be doing is engaging in a kind of rhetorical comradeship with the democracy movement and waiting. That the principal job of the Bush administration is to show its friendship toward the young people of Iran and not mess it up. Do you agree?
I'm very much of your friend's opinion. I mean, I grew this beard on the advice of the graduate student of mine, an Iranian, who was my guide. He said, if you want to go to the Friday prayers and the Death to America events, you better look as scruffy as you can. So I did, and so did he, but and it seemed to work, but also it made life very difficult. Often taxis wouldn't stop for us because they thought we were Hezbollah. And relatives of his would say, you know, we went to dinner with them, can't you shave that off? You look like some Islamic Republic nightmare. You could get spat on. You know, it's the hatred for the regime among the young is a delightful thing to see, as is the friendship towards the United States. And I have a word for it.
Yes.
Well, it's the baby boomerang. You see, the mullahs threw away so many of their young people in a suicide wave war with Saddam Hussein, which people I think still remember. The throwing away of handfuls of the younger generation. You know, what turned into a pointless war. They had to give Iranian women incentives to
produce,
make up the deficit. Now there is a baby boom, but it's a baby boomerang, because this younger generation despises the mullahs and the state that they run, wants to live in America, if it can't do that, wants to live an American life. The regime, meanwhile, is becoming visibly senile. It's not reproducing itself, palpably senile. And so even the Revolutionary Guards are getting a bit long in the tooth.
So you're quite confident?
Well, give it 10 years, and yes, it will metamorphose into something like a secular Middle Eastern democracy. But the timeline of Hezbollah and of the nukes isn't a 10-year timeline.
So Bush.
So it would be very. If you were the President of the United States, you said, I think let's just relax about Iran for about 10 years. I can see people saying, well, Mr. President, do you want it later to be said that you ignored the building of a secret tunnel in Isfahan for the concealment? It would be a tough call.
So Bush he needs to make his threatening noises, and he needs not to mess it up. He's doing all right.
There's no settled policy, though, in the administration.
I mean, in other words,
they're doing this not as a policy, because they're doing it because they haven't got a policy, not because they have. So I can't praise it.
But it's not doing too much harm.
It doesn't make me want to go and demonstrate, no.
Thank you very much. One last
the White House Gates test.
Final couple of questions. Describe the Arab world as you believe it will exist a decade from now. Alas, what I'm after here is the Wolfowitz vision, the Wolfowitz and Bush vision of democracy blossoming. Let me just ask you a couple of questions. Iraq will be a functioning democracy a decade from now?
There's every reason to think that it could be, yes.
Lebanon?
In some ways, Lebanon already is a functioning democracy.
And will there be a Palestinian state?
Yes, there certainly will be a Palestinian state. There should have been one 2 decades ago. There will be one a decade from now.
But that's in prospect?
Yes.
Good. Happy to hear it. Describe the reputation of George W. Bush a decade from now. Last question.
I'm going to a debate in England in a few weeks, sponsored by The Economist, where I was asked to come and take the side of the motion that said, thank God for George Bush. And I wrote and said, since I'll be at the same festival saying there's no God to thank, could we not rephrase the motion? And I said, I would prefer to have it said that history will be kinder, much kinder, to Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair than to Herr Schroeder or Mr. Chirac or Mr. Kofi Annan. And I think if I phrase it like that, I've answered your question.
You have indeed. Christopher Hitchens, thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.
Look at countries where religion dominates government. The World Bank and UN data show these regions consistently struggle with lower education outcomes, especially for women. In places where religious law controls policy, girls' education is restricted or delayed. That's not progress, that's control. Now compare that to more secular societies. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and most of Western Europe, where religion has less influence, rank higher in education, innovation, and quality of life. That's not a coincidence. Then look at internal conflict. Research from the Pew Research Center shows that countries with high religious tension also have higher levels of social instability and violence. Religion doesn't unify. It divides into competing truths that can't be tested or resolved.
Mosque after mosque to be opened in Britain, but try to open a church in Saudi Arabia and see what happens. There's no quid pro quo. And I actually, when I arrived in Atlanta, I turned on the TV, CNN, and the first person I saw was actually Christopher. And I was very alarmed, not at what he was saying, but at what he was speaking against, and that was the notion that there was a serious motion before the United Nations that saying anything critical of Islam would be criminalized. And that's the end of free speech, and it's very dangerous. Perhaps you want to comment on that, because I think you're probably much more astute observer of it than I am.
The United Nations non-binding, so far non-binding resolution, which is carried now for 3 years, and was carried again this week, sponsored by Pakistan, a country for which we pay. It isn't really even a country, barely even a state. It's a construct of Muslim partitionism carved out of the body of India. It wants to tell us what we can say and what we can think in our own country. And it says that we mustn't ever use the word Islam in any sentence that includes the words violation of human rights, for example. Now this is in the week when the government of Pakistan has handed over to the Taliban its most fertile valley, this valley of Swat, 100 miles from the capital, Islamabad, and said, you can run this valley, militarily and legally. You can have Sharia law, and you are the police and the enforcers of it. And you can close all the girls' schools. But we can't say that your religion is anything to do with the violation of human rights. It's preposterous. Your point about the one-way street is very well made, if I may say so. There are madrasas within 50 miles of where I live in Washington, in Virginia. There are Saudi paid-for schools that preach violent anti-Semitism, hatred of the Shia Muslims. Remember, don't ever forget, they hate other Muslims too. Of Hindus, of Christians and Crusaders, and of course of atheists. So they've got me, what, 3 times, I suppose, in this field of fire. And don't worry, it's coming to a place near you. The Qurans that are given out in our prison system to Muslim prisoners by Muslim chaplains, paid for by Saudi Arabia, are Qurans written to the Wahhabi tune. They're not just your everyday Quran, they're the Qurans that the Wahhabis want you to read, containing direct incitement. They've been given out with taxpayers' money in the prison system. Militias are forming. Next you'll have militias of this kind with their own chaplains within the United States Armed Forces. Are you ready for that? Are you ready to have Wahhabi preachers in the US Armed Forces? You better get ready for it, unless you're going to take the James Madison view that there shouldn't be any chaplains in the US Armed Forces to begin with, or in the prison system. People want to pray, you can't stop them. But we cannot have state-subsidized prayer. We cannot have state-subsidized preachers or chaplains. Give it up, or give it to your deadliest enemy and pay for the rope that will choke you. This is very urgent business, ladies and gentlemen, I beseech you. Resist it while you still can, and before the right to complain is taken away from you, which will be the next thing. You will be told you can't complain because you're Islamophobic. The term is already being introduced into the culture as if it was an accusation of race hatred, for example, or bigotry, whereas it's only the objection to the preachings of a very extreme and absolutist religion. Watch out for these symptoms. They are not just symptoms of surrender, very often ecumenically offered to you by men of God in other robes, Christian and Jewish and smarmy ecumenical. These are the ones who will hold open the gates for the barbarians. The barbarians never take a city till someone holds the gates open for them. And it's your own preachers who will do it for you, and your own multicultural authorities who will do it for you. Resist it while you can. And if you wonder what will happen if you don't, look and see how a cricket team in Middlesex in England had to change its name by force last week, because it was called, and had been for years, the Middlesex Crusaders. Look and see how stories about little pigs can't be taught to children in English schools anymore, lest offense be taken by the religion of peace. Resist it while you can.
Salman Rushdie wrote a novel, and the response was threats, violence, and calls for death. That alone shows the problem. An idea that reacts to words with violence is not strong. It's fragile. Free speech is a measurable foundation of stable societies. The Cato Institute Human Freedom Index shows countries that protect speech rank higher in prosperity and safety. The opposite is also clear. Places that punish blasphemy have higher censorship, more violence, and weaker legal systems. Look at the numbers. According to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, multiple countries still enforce blasphemy laws with prison or death penalties. That means questioning religion can cost your life. Even in scripture, the pattern is there. In Islam, hadith literature includes punishment for leaving the faith. In Christianity, Leviticus 24:16 calls for death for blasphemy.
Not all monotheisms are exactly the same at the moment. They're all based on the same illusion, they're all plagiarisms of each other, but there's one in particular that at the moment is posing a serious menace not just to freedom of speech and freedom of expression, but to quite a lot of other freedoms too. And this is the religion that exhibits the horrible trio of self-hatred, self-righteousness, and self-pity. I'm talking about militant Islam. Globally, it's a gigantic power. Globally, it's a gigantic power. It controls an enormous amount of oil wealth, several large countries and states, with an enormous fortune. It's pumping the ideology of Wahhabism and Salafism around the world, poisoning societies where it goes, ruining the minds of children, stultifying the young in its madrasas, training people in violence, making a cult of death and suicide and murder. That's what it does globally. It's quite strong. In our societies, it poses as a cringing minority whose faith you might offend, which deserves all the protection that a small and vulnerable group might need. Now, it makes quite large claims for itself, doesn't it? It says it's the final revelation. It says that God spoke to one illiterate businessman in the Arabian Peninsula 3 times through an archangel, and that the resulting material, which as you can see when you read it, is largely plagiarized from the Old and the New Testament, almost all of it actually plagiarized ineptly from the Old and New Testament, is to be accepted as a divine revelation and as the final and unalterable one, and that those who do not accept this revelation are fit to be treated as cattle, infidels, potential chattel, slaves, and victims. Well, I tell you what, I don't think Muhammad ever heard those voices. I don't believe it. And the likelihood that I'm right, as opposed to the likelihood that a shepherd a businessman who couldn't read, had bits of the Old and New Testament re-dictated to him by an archangel, I think puts me much more near the position of being objectively correct. But who is the one under threat? The person who promulgates this and says, I'd better listen because if I don't, I'm in danger? Or me, who says, oh, no, I think this is so silly you could even publish a cartoon about it? And up go the placards, and up go the yells and the howls and the screams. Behead those. This is in London. This is in Toronto. This is in New York. It's right in our midst now. Behead those who cartoon Islam. Do they get arrested for hate speech? No. Might I get in trouble for saying what I've just said about the Prophet Muhammad? Yes, I might. Where are your priorities, ladies and gentlemen? You're giving away what's most precious in your own society, and you're giving it away without a fight, and you're even praising the people who want to deny you the right to resist it. Shame on you while you do this. Make the best use of the time you've got left. This is really serious. Now, if you look anywhere you like, because we've had invocations of a rather drivelling and sickly kind tonight of our sympathy. What about the poor fags? What about the poor Jews, the wretched women who can't take the abuse and the slaves and their descendants and the tribes who didn't make it and were told that their land was forfeit. Look anywhere you like for the warrant for slavery, for the subjection of women as chattel, for the burning and flogging of homosexuals, for ethnic cleansing, for anti-Semitism, for all of this. You look no further than a famous book that's on every pulpit in this city and in every synagogue and in every mosque. And then just see whether you can square the fact that the force that is the main source of hatred is also the main caller for censorship. And when you realize that you're therefore this evening faced with a gigantic false antithesis, I hope that still won't stop you from giving the motion before you the resounding endorsement that it deserves. Thanks awfully. Night-night. Stay cool.
Judaism, Christianity, and Islam share the same stories, the same figures, the same structure. That's not divine revelation. That's historical copying. Scholars in comparative religion have documented how texts evolved over time, shaped by earlier traditions and local culture. Then look at the claims. Islam says it's the final, perfect message. Christianity says salvation only comes through one figure. These are exclusive claims with zero verifiable evidence. You're told to accept them or face consequences, eternal punishment, or being labeled an enemy. Now look at outcomes tied to doctrine. In several countries governed by strict interpretations of religion, Human Rights Watch reports ongoing punishment for homosexuality, restrictions on women's rights, and limits on free expression. These aren't fringe cases. They're built into legal systems influenced by religious texts. And here's the contradiction. These same systems demand protection from criticism. They want authority without scrutiny. That's not truth. Truth can be tested. These claims can't. So here's the real question. After everything we've talked about, do you think any religion should be called a religion of peace without being questioned? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more breakdowns like this, don't forget to like and subscribe.